These centers, buried in secrecy, have operated in places like Agargaon and Uttara for decades. Cells so small, so suffocating, that detainees described them as animal cages. Former prisoners shared accounts of relentless interrogations designed to strip them of their will, days, even months, of isolation and sensory deprivation. Can you imagine, really, what that does to a person? Physically, mentally, spiritually? The aim was clear: to silence anyone who dared to raise their voice. And the instruments of this repression, the state's own machinery, weaponized against its people. Under Sheikh Hasina's leadership, allegations have mounted that agencies like the DGFI, the National Intelligence Agency, were actively detaining dissenters on trumped-up charges. No due process, no oversight, just a calculated effort to maintain control by crushing opposition. It's chilling to think how normalized such practices became, how they eroded any expectation of basic human rights for so many. One story that stuck with me came from a journalist now living in exile. She described how she once spoke out against corruption in Bangladesh and received anonymous warnings to stop. When she didn't, her colleagues began disappearing, one by one. She fled the country. She told me she hasn't been back in over 10 years because the fear of arbitrary detention still looms large. And she's not alone. So many activists and thinkers have been scattered across the globe, not because they wanted to leave, but because they had to. It's tragic, isn't it? For these individuals, the choice has always been stark: risk everything or lose your voice entirely. And for those who stayed, who resisted, who were dragged into Ainagor, the system itself ensured their silence in the most brutal ways. The chief advisor's visit to Ainagor has forced a national reckoning that was long overdue. But as we'll see in the next chapter, this is not just about secret prisons. It's about how entire state institutions were transformed into tools of political control, a system that, well, let's just say, it's far more insidious than these detention centers alone. When examining how a system of repression like this comes into being, it's impossible to ignore the role of state institutions. Under Sheikh Hasina's regime, these institutions weren't just passive enforcers, they were weaponized. Agencies like the National Intelligence Agency and the Directorate General of Forces Intelligence weren't there to serve the people, but to control them, to ensure dissent was a risk few dared to take. But how does that happen?